The stars had witnessed many things across the endless ages of the universe, but few species had commanded their respect like the dragons of the Draconis Imperium. And for 12,000 years, these magnificent beings had ruled the Orion Spur with fire and wisdom and terrible beauty. Kethvirax was young by the standards of her ancient people, having lived only 800 years in a civilization where elders remembered the birth of galaxies, and she served as a warden of the frontier, a sacred duty that tasked her with protecting the border territories from all threats that might emerge from the dark spaces between stars. Her body stretched 200 meters from snout to tail, covered in scales that shimmered like liquid metal, and could deflect the plasma fire of warships. And her wings, when fully spread, could block out the light of small moons, and her breath burned at temperatures that matched the hearts of dying stars. She was powerful beyond the imagination of most species, yet she was also alone on this patrol, flying through the cold vacuum of space as easily as a fish swims through water, her ancient biology allowing her to survive where no other organic creature could. The attack came without warning. The Void Collective had been quiet for centuries, lurking in the spaces between galaxies, but now they surged forward with a fleet of black ships that seemed to drink in light itself, and their target was a trade convoy carrying members of 17 different species through neutral territory. Kethvirax heard the distress calls crackling across every frequency, heard the screaming and the begging and the desperate prayers of thousands of beings who had never done anything to deserve such a fate, and she did not hesitate for even a single moment. She dove into the battle like a comet of golden fire, her breath weapon cutting through void ships like a blade through paper, and the enemy turned their attention to her because they recognized the greater threat, because even the Collective feared the dragons of the Imperium. The convoy fled while Kethvirax fought, and she was grateful for this, because it meant her sacrifice would mean something. It meant that thousands of lives would continue, because she had chosen to stand between them and annihilation. But the Collective had prepared for this war, had spent centuries developing weapons designed specifically to kill her kind, and the warheads that struck her were not ordinary explosives, but carriers of terrible things. Nanites burrowed beneath her scales, microscopic machines designed to eat her from the inside, and necrotic compounds spread through her golden blood like poison, and she felt her magnificent body beginning to fail, even as she destroyed the last of the attacking ships. The convoy was safe now, jumping to slip space and carrying their precious cargo of living beings to safety, and Kethvirax allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the pain truly began. She needed to return to the Imperium, needed to reach her people and their healers, who alone understood the biology of dragons. But she was so far from home and growing weaker with every passing moment. Her navigation systems were damaged, and her thoughts were becoming clouded with agony. But she managed one final jump through slipspace, aiming for anywhere that might offer shelter, anywhere she might find help before her body gave out completely. She emerged on the fringes of Galactic Union territory and crashed onto an unnamed moon with an impact that cracked the surface for kilometers in every direction, and she lay there in a crater of her own making, bleeding iridescent gold into the gray dust. The Galactic Union was a loose confederation of species who had formed their alliance partially out of fear of beings like her, and she knew that she had no friends here, no allies who might come to her aid. Her distress beacon activated automatically, broadcasting her location and her condition to anyone who might be listening, and she could only hope that somewhere in this vast and cold universe there was someone who would answer. The pain was beyond anything she had ever experienced in 8 centuries of life, and the nanites continued their terrible work inside her body, and the necrotic poison spread through her systems like fire through dry grass. She could feel herself dying, could feel the slow failure of organs that had functioned perfectly for hundreds of years, and she wondered if this was how it ended for a warden of the frontier, alone and broken on a forgotten moon. Her eye, larger than most spacecraft, stared up at the unfamiliar stars, and she tried to remember the constellations of her homeworld, tried to recall the faces of her clutch siblings and the warm rumble of her mother's voice. But the memories were becoming harder to hold on to as the poison crept closer, and she felt the cold embrace of darkness beginning to close around her, worked its way toward her brain, and she knew that she did not have much time left unless help arrived. The hours passed slowly, each one feeling like a century of suffering, and Keth Virax listened to the communications frequencies with growing despair as she heard the galaxy's response to her distress call. Ships passed through nearby systems, but none changed course to approach her, and she could hear them talking about her on open channels, discussing the wounded dragon like she was a curiosity rather than a living being in desperate need. Some spoke of the old wars, of grudges that stretched back generations, of reasons why the dragons deserved no mercy from the Union species, and Keth Virax wanted to scream that she had never participated in those ancient conflicts, that she had spent her entire life protecting beings of all species from threats like the Void Collective. But she was too weak to broadcast, too damaged to do anything but listen and suffer. Wait for death to finally claim her. The temperature on the moon dropped as its slow rotation carried her crater into shadow, and she felt the cold seeping into her wounds, and she wondered if freezing would be more merciful than the nanites. 6 days passed in this manner, 6 days of agony and despair, and the slow dimming of hope, and Keth Virax began to accept that this was truly the end, that she would die alone and unmourned on this barren rock. She had saved thousands of lives in that final battle, had given everything she had to protect beings who would never know her name, and now those same beings were leaving her to rot because of crimes committed by her ancestors long before she was born. It seemed a poor reward for sacrifice, but Keth Virax had never fought for rewards, had never expected gratitude from those she protected, had simply done her duty because it was right, and because she could not bear to watch innocent beings suffer. As her hope had finally died completely, she detected a small ship entering orbit above the moon, impossibly tiny compared to the vessels of most spacefaring species, and she recognized the design from her studies of the younger races. It was a human ship. Keth Virax had heard of humans, but had never encountered one directly, knew only that they were a young species with brief lives and fragile bodies who had somehow spread across hundreds of worlds in a remarkably short time. She could not imagine what one of them was doing here, could not understand why such a small and weak creature would approach a dying dragon when far mightier species had fled. But the ship descended toward the surface, and Keth Virax felt something stir in her chest that she had thought extinguished forever. The news of the wounded dragon spread across Galactic Union channels like wildfire through dry brush, and within hours, every major species knew that a Draconis warden lay dying on an unnamed moon at the edge of their territory. Communication networks buzzed with discussion and debate, with old memories and older hatreds, and the responses came swiftly from every corner of the Union. The Velith Consortium received the distress call first, because they maintained the most sophisticated medical monitoring systems in the known galaxy, and their physicians were renowned throughout 1,000 star systems for their ability to heal wounds that other species considered fatal. But the Velith High Council convened for only 17 minutes before issuing their response, and their words were broadcast on open frequencies for all to hear. The Draconis burned 3 of our colony worlds during the border wars, the Velith spokesperson declared. Hatred. And we still remember the screams of our ancestors as dragon fire fell from the sky, and we will not lift a single instrument to help one of their kind. So let her rot in the darkness she has earned." Keth-Virax heard these words through their damaged communication systems, and felt a deep sadness settle over her heart, because she had not even been born when those wars took place, had spent her entire existence trying to protect life rather than destroy it. But the Veleth did not care about who she was or what she had done, caring only about what her species had been centuries before her birth. The Krill Dominion responded next, a warrior culture that respected strength above all other virtues, and many had expected them to offer assistance simply because of their admiration for the power of dragons. "A dying dragon is still a dragon," the Krill war leader growled across the frequencies, "and her death throes could destroy any ship that approaches. Warrior foolish enough to enter her reach. And we did not conquer half the outer rim by taking foolish risks. So we will wait and watch and let nature take its course." The Alari Collective, known throughout the galaxy as empaths and pacifists, who felt the emotions of others as strongly as their own, sent a response that was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. "We sense her pain across the void," the Alari spokesperson whispered, their voice trembling with shared agony. "And it is vast beyond measure, oceanic in its depth, and terrible in its intensity, and we cannot bear to be near such suffering, cannot function in the presence of such overwhelming anguish, so we offer our sorrow and our prayers, but we cannot offer our presence." The Mordeth Assembly did not even pretend to have noble reasons for their refusal, broadcasting their intentions with the casual cruelty that had made them despised throughout the Union. Dragon scales sell for billions of credits on the black market, the Mordeth trademaster announced with audible greed. And dragon bones are worth even more, worth entire planetary economies. So we will wait for nature to take its course, and then we will harvest what remains, because profit is profit, regardless of its source. Keth-Virax listened to each refusal with diminishing hope, feeling the last embers of her spirit growing cold, as species after species turned away from her suffering. The Galactic Union Council held an emergency session to discuss the situation. Representatives from hundreds of worlds gathering in their great assembly hall to debate the fate of a single dying creature. The arguments lasted for hours, with some delegates pointing out that helping the dragon might improve relations with the Imperium, while others insisted that the dragons had never helped the Union and deserved no help in return. In the end, the vote was unanimous, every single representative choosing non-intervention, choosing to let Keth-Virax die alone on that forgotten moon. "We lack the technology to heal a creature of her size and complexity," the Council announced in their official statement. "And the risks of approaching a wounded dragon are too great, and the Draconis Imperium has never extended aid to Union species. So we see no reason to extend aid to them." 6 days passed, while Keth-Virax lay bleeding and broken. 6 days during which ships passed through nearby systems and changed course to avoid her. 6 days during which she heard the galaxy discuss her impending death like it was merely an interesting news story. She had protected beings of every species in that convoy, had fought and bled and sacrificed everything to save lives that meant nothing to her personally. And now those same species were debating whether her corpse would be more valuable sold whole or in pieces. The despair that settled over her was deeper than the void between galaxies, space between stars, and she began to accept that her 800 years of life would end in this crater of dust and blood. But on the 7th day, something changed. A small ship appeared on her sensors, so tiny that she almost dismissed it as debris, approaching the moon with what seemed like deliberate purpose. The vessel was of human design, a species she knew almost nothing about, and it was broadcasting a simple message on repeat as it descended toward the surface. "This is Captain Alara Vance of the salvage vessel's Second Chance," the message said, "and I am responding to your distress call, so please do not fire upon my ship." Keth-Virax could not understand why a human would come here, could not comprehend what possible motivation could drive such a small and fragile creature to approach a dying dragon when the mightiest species in the Union had fled. The ship landed 100 meters from her crater, settling onto the dust with a gentle bump. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the airlock opened, and a figure emerged, tiny beyond belief, wrapped in a simple environmental suit that looked like it had been repaired many times over many years. The human walked toward her across the gray dust, carrying a medical kit in one hand and a scanner in the other. And HFY watched this impossible approach with an eye larger than the creature's entire body. She could kill this human with a single breath, could crush her with the smallest movement of her tail, could end this strange encounter in a heartbeat if she chose. But instead, she simply watched, fascinated despite her pain by the steady determination in the human's stride. "What are you doing, small thing?" HFY asked, her voice rumbling through the thin atmosphere and vibrating the human's bones. The human did not stop walking, did not show any sign of fear, simply continued her approach while answering in a voice that was calm and steady. "Helping," the human said. "You cannot help me," HFY replied, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and frustration at this foolish creature's stubbornness. "Because my wounds are beyond your medicine, beyond anyone's medicine, beyond anything that your small hands and simple tools could hope to repair." "Probably," the human admitted, still walking closer, still refusing to turn back. "But I am going to try anyway." HFY fell silent, unable to find words to respond to this simple declaration, unable to understand how such a small being could possess such enormous determination. The human reached her side and began scanning her wounds, began taking readings and muttering observations, began working as if healing a dying dragon was just another problem to be solved. "Why?" HFY finally asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep in her ancient soul. "Why would you come here when everyone else refused? Why would you risk your brief life for a creature you have never met?" The human looked up at her, meeting her massive eye with a gaze that held no fear and no calculation and no expectation of reward. "Because you called for help," the human said simply, "and that is enough." For the first time in 6 days, HFY felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Captain Ilara Vance had lived 37 years in a galaxy that often seemed designed to crush the hopes of small beings. And she had learned many lessons in that time about survival and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Her ship, the Second Chance, was a salvage vessel, held together with patch welds and determination, crewed by a small band of misfits who had found family in each other when the universe had denied them families of their own. When the distress call had come through, Ilara had been running a routine salvage operation 3 systems away, and her crew had watched her face change as she listened to the dragon's beacon. "We are changing course," she had announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. Her co-pilot Soren, a Veleth who had left his homeworld years ago after disagreeing with their isolationist policies, had stared at her like she had grown a second head. "You want to approach a wounded dragon?" Soren had demanded, his medical training warring with his survival instincts. "Do you understand what even a dying dragon can do to a ship this size?" "I understand," Ilara had replied, already plotting the new course. "The Union has declared non-intervention," their engineer Crix had pointed out, the small Mordith wringing his hands nervously. "We could face sanctions, could lose our salvage license, could be blacklisted from every port in the sector." "Then we will find new ports," Ilara had said. "Captain," Soren had tried one more time, his voice pleading now. "Even if we reach her, even if she does not kill us in her pain, what can we possibly do? We are not equipped to treat injuries on that scale. We do not have the supplies or the knowledge or the—" "Then we will figure it out," Ilara had interrupted, her eyes fixed on the navigation display, because she is alone, and she is dying, and no one else is coming." Soren had fallen silent then, recognizing the look in his captain's eyes. The same look she had worn when she pulled him out of that wreckage 5 years ago. The same look she wore whenever she encountered suffering she could not ignore. "I will not be part of this suicide mission," he had finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "Then stay with the ship," Alara had replied without anger. "But I am going." And so she had taken a shuttle down to the moon's surface alone, carrying medical supplies meant for beings a fraction of the dragon's size, armed with nothing but a cracked scanner and the absolute certainty that she could not live with herself if she did nothing. Keth Virax, dwarfed by the dragon's enormous form, and she could see the devastation that the void weapons had caused. The wounds were horrific, great tears in the magnificent scales that oozed golden blood, and she could see the black tendrils of nanite infection spreading beneath the surface like veins of darkness. "Your wounds are infected with some kind of nanite technology," Alara said, running her scanner along one of the larger gashes, "and there appears to be a necrotic compound in your bloodstream that is accelerating the damage." "I know what is killing me," Keth Virax rumbled, her voice weaker than before, "and I have accepted my fate, so you should leave now, before my death throes trap you here." "I did not come all this way to leave," Alara replied, already opening her medical kit, "so you might as well stop trying to convince me." She began to work, using techniques that had never been designed for creatures of this scale, adapting tools meant for small wounds to address injuries larger than her entire body. The scanner showed her the pattern of nanite spread, and she realized that if she could slow their advance, she might be able to buy time for the dragon's own healing systems to fight back. "I need to access the wound sites directly," she announced, looking at a gash that opened into the dragon's flesh like a cave. "And that means I'm going to have to go inside." Keth Virax's massive eye blinked slowly, and something that might have been disbelief flickered across her alien features. "You intend to enter my body?" the dragon asked. "The nanite clusters are concentrated at specific points," Alara explained, already gathering her tools, "and if I can remove them manually, I might be able to slow the infection." "That is insane," Keth Virax said. "Probably," Alara agreed, and she climbed into the wound. The interior of a dragon was like nothing she had ever experienced, of muscle and tissue that pulsed with golden light, and she worked her way through this alien landscape with careful determination. She found the first nanite cluster attached to a major blood vessel, a mass of black machines that writhed with malevolent purpose. And she used her tools to carefully extract it piece by piece. The work was slow and exhausting, requiring precision that her trembling hands could barely maintain. But she refused to stop, refused to give up, refused to let this magnificent creature die while she still had strength to fight. Hours passed as she worked, and she lost track of time in the golden darkness of the dragon's interior, focused entirely on the task of saving a life that the entire galaxy had abandoned. When she finally emerged from the wound, covered in golden blood and shaking with fatigue, she found that she was no longer alone on the surface. Her shuttle had been joined by several other ships, human vessels, that had appeared while she worked, and figures in environmental suits were approaching with additional supplies. "Captain Vance?" a voice called across the communication channel. "This is Dr. Maya Chen, from the Terran Frontier Corps medical frigate Hippocrates, and we picked up your broadcasts about the dragon's condition." Alara stared at the approaching figures with exhausted confusion. "How did you get here so fast?" she asked. "We were in the next system running a training exercise," Dr. Chen replied, "and when we heard what you were attempting, we could not stay away." More ships were descending now, more humans emerging to join the effort, and Alara felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized she was no longer alone. "I am Dr. James Okonkwo," another figure introduced himself. Xenobiologist from the University of New Lagos, and I wrote my thesis on theoretical Draconis physiology, based on what little data exists, and I never thought I would have a chance to apply it. I am Marcus Webb, a third voice added, retired combat medic, and I saw your broadcasts and thought someone should help that woman, so here I am. Ilara looked at these strangers who had crossed star systems to join her impossible mission, looked at their determined faces and their ready hands, and she felt something warm spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank us when she is healed," Dr. Chen replied, already moving toward the dragon with her own scanner, "because we have a lot of work to do." From orbit, Soren watched more human ships arriving, watched his crewmates and strangers working together around the fallen dragon, and he felt something shift inside his heart. "I am coming down," he transmitted, his voice heavy with shame. "Tell me what you need." Keth Virax watched all of this, with an eye that held wonder and confusion and the faint glimmer of returning hope. Creatures, these brief and fragile beings, had come from across the stars to save her life, had risked everything for a stranger who belonged to a species that had given them nothing. She did not understand them, could not comprehend what drove them to such selfless action. But as she watched them work, she felt something ancient stirring in her heart. It felt like gratitude. It felt like wonder. It felt like the beginning of something new. What followed became the stuff of legend, whispered in ports and stations across the galaxy. A story that grew with each telling until it became difficult to separate fact from myth. But those who were there knew the truth, knew that the reality was both more difficult and more beautiful than any legend could capture. The treatment lasted 19 days. 19 days of desperation and improvisation, and the stubborn human refusal to accept that something was impossible, simply because it had never been done before. Captain Ilara Vance led the effort, with the same determination that had brought her to the moon in the first place, coordinating the growing team of humans who had answered her call, delegating tasks and solving problems, and pushing herself beyond the limits of exhaustion. Dr. Maya Chen established a field hospital at the base of the dragon's neck, converting cargo containers into sterile treatment chambers, synthesizing medications from raw materials that had never been intended for this purpose. Dr. James Okonkwo provided theoretical frameworks for understanding dragon physiology, translating his academic knowledge into practical treatment protocols, learning more in those 19 days than he had learned in 20 years of study. Marcus Webb led the teams that entered the dragon's body to manually extract nanite clusters, his combat medical experience proving invaluable in the dangerous environment of living tissue and golden blood. Soren overcame his fear and his shame to become one of the most dedicated workers, his Veleth medical training combining with the human approaches to create treatment methods that had never existed before. More humans continued to arrive throughout the treatment, drawn by broadcasts that had spread across the communication networks, and each one brought skills and supplies and the same stubborn hope that had defined this mission from the beginning. Named Sarah Park, developed a compound that could neutralize the necrotic poison in the dragon's blood, working for 40 hours straight without sleep to perfect the formula. An engineer named David Kim designed and built specialized tools for the extraction teams, adapting ship repair equipment into precision medical instruments. A pilot named Aisha Osman ran supply missions to nearby systems, trading the crew's personal possessions for medical materials that the team desperately needed. They made mistakes. Of course they made mistakes, because they were attempting something that no one had ever tried before. Something that the greatest medical minds in the galaxy had declared impossible. But when they made mistakes, they learned from them, adapted their approaches, found new solutions, and refused to let setbacks become defeats. On the 8th day, the necrotic poison finally stopped spreading, neutralized by Sarah Park's compound working in combination with the dragon's own immune system. On the 12th day, the last of the major nanite clusters was extracted, removed from Ketvirax's body by teams of exhausted humans who had become more familiar with dragon anatomy than any non-dragon had ever been. On the 15th day, the wounds began to heal, golden tissue regenerating at a rate that amazed even Dr. Okonkwo, as if the dragon's body had simply been waiting for the chance to repair itself. Throughout it all, Ilara talked to Ketvirax, keeping the dragon's mind engaged while her body fought for survival, asking questions about her life and her people and her experiences across 8 centuries of existence. "Tell me about your homeworld," Ilara said one night, sitting beside the dragon's massive head as the stars wheeled overhead. "It is called Pyralis," Ketvirax answered, her voice stronger than it had been in days, "and it orbits a red giant star that fills half the sky. Tall that their peaks touch the edge of space." "That sounds beautiful," Ilara said. Ketvirax agreed, "and I have not seen it in 50 years, not since I began my service as a warden, and I had accepted that I might never see it again." "You will see it again," Ilara promised, "because we are not going to let you die here." Ketvirax was quiet for a long moment, her massive eye reflecting the starlight, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft with wonder. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "Why do any of you care, when my people have given you no reason to show such kindness?" Ilara considered the question carefully, knowing that it deserved a real answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that we care because caring is what makes us human, and because the universe is dark and cold and often cruel, and the only way to fight that darkness is to choose kindness even when it costs us something." "Even when the one you help is a stranger?" Ketvirax asked. "Especially then," Ilara replied, "because strangers are just friends we have not met yet, and every act of kindness ripples outward in ways we cannot predict." The dragon fell silent again, processing this strange philosophy, trying to understand how such small beings could possess such enormous hearts. On the 19th day, Ilara and her team made their final assessments, checking every wound and every system and every indicator that they had learned to read over nearly 3 weeks of constant work. "I think she is ready," Dr. Chen announced, her voice thick with exhaustion and hope. "Ready for what?" Soren asked. "Ready to stand," Ilara said, looking up at the dragon with a smile that she could not suppress. "Ready to rise." Ketvirax had been listening to this conversation, and she felt a surge of emotion that she had no name for, a mixture of gratitude and wonder and something that felt almost like. Slowly, carefully, she began to move for the first time in 19 days, testing muscles that had been still for so long, flexing wings that had lain folded against her back. The humans watched in awed silence as the dragon rose, her massive body lifting from the crater that had been her deathbed, her scales catching the light of distant stars and reflecting it back in cascades of gold and silver. She stood at her full height for the first time since her battle with the Void Collective, 200 meters of ancient majesty and terrible beauty, and she spread her wings wide to feel the solar wind against their membranes. The humans cheered, their voices tiny against the vastness of space, but Ketvirax heard every single one of them, felt every vibration of their joy as if it were her own. She looked down at the small beings who had saved her life, at Captain Ilara Vance, who stood at the front of the group with tears streaming down her face, and she knew that she would never forget what they had done. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried across the moon's surface like thunder, like music, like a promise. "You are welcome," Ilara replied, and in those simple words was contained everything that needed to be said. Ketvirax had come to this moon expecting to die, abandoned by a galaxy that had decided she was not worth saving. Instead, she had found something she had never expected, something that the dragons of the Imperium had never encountered in 12,000 years of existence. She had found humanity. and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. The Galactic Union expected war, expected the terrible vengeance of the Draconis Imperium to fall upon them, like fire from the heavens, because surely the dragons would be furious that their warden had been left to die while the Union debated and delayed and ultimately chose to do nothing. Emergency sessions were held across hundreds of worlds, defense fleets were mobilized, and evacuation plans were drawn up for colonies closest to the Imperium's borders. But the war never came. Instead, something far more unexpected occurred, something that would reshape the political landscape of the Orion Spur for generations to come. Keth Virax returned to the Imperium with a story that she had to tell, a story that demanded to be heard by the oldest and wisest of her kind, and she requested an audience with the Council of Ancients. The council had not convened for outsider testimony in 3,000 years, had not lowered themselves to hear the words of any being younger than the stars themselves. But something in Keth Virax's request caught their attention. Perhaps it was the passion in her words, perhaps it was the strangeness of her survival, or perhaps the ancients sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy, and they needed to understand what it was. They granted her audience. The council chambers were carved from the heart of an ancient moon, vast beyond comprehension, lit by captured stars that floated in crystalline spheres. And the ancients themselves were dragons so old that they had watched civilizations rise and fall like seasons. Keth Virax stood before them, still bearing the silver scars of her healing, and she told her story from the beginning. She told them of her battle with the Void Collective, of her sacrifice to save 17 species worth of convoy travelers, of her crash on the unnamed moon, and the 6 days she had spent dying while the galaxy refused to help. Listened in silence, their eyes like pools of ancient fire, their minds containing memories older than most stars. And then, Keth Virax said, her voice ringing through the vast chamber, the humans came. She described Alara Vance's approach, a single small figure walking across the gray dust toward a dying dragon, carrying tools meant for beings a fraction of her patient's size. She described the 19 days of treatment, the improvisation and desperation and stubborn hope, the way more humans had arrived to help, until a small army of fragile beings was working to save her life. She described the conversation she had with Alara, the philosophy of kindness she had learned, the way humans seemed to believe that every life was worth saving, regardless of cost or consequence. They are small, Keth Virax said, with lives that last barely a century if fortune favors them, and they have no scales to protect them, no fire to defend them, no claws or wings or any of the gifts that we possess. The ancients remained silent, watching her with eyes that had witnessed the birth of galaxies. And yet, Keth Virax continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. When I called for help, when every species in the Union turned away, when the mightiest civilizations chose to let me die, these small and brief and fragile creatures came to save me. She raised her head, her scars catching the light of the captive stars. Not for reward, she said, because they asked nothing of me and expected nothing in return. And not for alliance, because humanity has no treaties with the Imperium. And not for fear of consequence, because they had no reason to think we would care what happened to one warden on a forgotten moon. She paused, letting her words settle into the ancient silence. They came because I was suffering, she said, and they could not bear to do nothing. The eldest of the ancients, a dragon named Vorithax, who had watched the first stars ignite in the young universe, finally spoke. Why should we care about the actions of these brief creatures? He asked, his voice like mountains grinding against each other. What do their small kindnesses matter to the Imperium? Keth Virax had prepared for this question, had thought about it during the long journey home, and she answered without hesitation. Because in all our 12,000 years of dominion, she said, In all our wars and conquests and treaties, we have never encountered a species like them, and we have underestimated them because they are small and weak and die so quickly." She looked at each of the ancients in turn, meeting their ancient gazes with her own. "But strength is not measured only in fire and scale," she said, "and power is not only found in weapons and armies. And these humans have something that we have never fully understood, something that may be more powerful than all are." "And what is that?" Vorathax asked. "Compassion," Keth-Virax answered. "Given freely, without calculation, kindness extended to strangers without expectation of return, the willingness to risk everything to help someone who can offer nothing in exchange." The ancients deliberated for 3 days, their minds moving at speeds that younger beings could not comprehend, considering the implications of what they had heard. When they emerged from their deliberation, they issued a decree that sent shockwaves across the known galaxy. The Draconis Imperium would extend formal protection to Earth and all human colonies, declaring that any attack on humanity would be considered an attack on the Imperium itself, and that the full might of dragonkind would be deployed in defense of these small beings who had proven themselves worthy of such honor. The Galactic Union was stunned by this announcement, unable to comprehend how their decision to abandon a dying dragon had resulted in the humans gaining the most powerful allies in the galaxy. The Void Collective, learning of this new alliance, retreated from 3 sectors overnight, unwilling to risk war with both humanity and the dragons. And Captain Ilara Vance, sitting in the cramped quarters of her salvage ship, held together with patchwelds and stubbornness, received a personal message from Keth-Virax. "You asked me once about my favorite nebula," the message read, "and I told you it was the Vale of Andros, where stars are born in rivers of light that stretch across light years, and where the colors are so beautiful that even my ancient eyes never tire of seeing them. When you are ready, small one, I will take you there, and I will show you the universe as my people see it, from the heart of newborn stars to the edges of reality itself. This is not repayment, because nothing could ever repay what you gave me, and this is not obligation, because I owe you more than I could ever express in mere words. This is simply what I wish to do for my friend." Ilara read the message twice, then a 3rd time, feeling tears forming in her eyes as she had on that distant moon, when she realized she was not alone. She had never expected gratitude, had never wanted reward, had simply done what seemed right because she could not have lived with herself if she had done nothing. But now she had a friend who measured her life in centuries, who could cross the galaxy on wings of fire, who considered humanity worthy of protection because one small human had refused to let her die. Soren found her sitting in the cockpit, staring out at the stars with a smile on her face. "Good news?" he asked. "The best," Ilara replied, and she showed him the message. Years later, when the story of the wounded dragon had spread to every corner of the galaxy, when humanity had become known as the species that would help anyone in need, she found herself smiling again. Regardless of the cost, a Velith diplomat would approach a human ambassador at a peace conference and ask a question that had been bothering him for decades. "Why did you help her?" the Velith asked, "when the rest of us refused, when it seemed like madness, when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose?" The human ambassador smiled, and her answer was the same answer that Ilara had given on that distant moon all those years ago. "Because she called for help," the ambassador said, "and that was enough." The Velith did not understand, could not comprehend how such a simple reason could drive beings to risk their lives for strangers. But he filed the answer away in his memory and pondered it for years to come. And across the galaxy, species that had watched humanity's rise with confusion and sometimes fear began to learn a phrase that humans used, a phrase that seemed to capture something essential about their strange philosophy. Behind. They learned that humans meant it, that they would cross star systems and defy empires and stand against impossible odds to save a single life. And that this stubborn compassion was not weakness, but a form of strength that the galaxy had never encountered before. The universe remained vast and dark and often cruel, but wherever humans traveled, they carried that light of kindness with them, and the darkness retreated just a little bit more with each act of compassion. Keth Virax lived for another 3,000 years after her rescue, and in all that time, she never forgot the lesson she had learned on that unnamed moon. She never forgot that sometimes the smallest beings can have the largest hearts, and that hope can survive, even in the darkest places, if someone is brave enough to carry it. And whenever she told the story of her rescue to younger dragons, she always ended it the same way. Never underestimate the humans, she would say. They will surprise you every time. And she would smile, remembering a small figure walking across gray dust toward a dying dragon, carrying nothing but a medical kit and the absolute refusal to give up. That was the day everything changed. That was the day the galaxy learned what humanity truly was.